Welcome to The World Today. I'm Sana Maqbool, and in today's show, we will be talking about the Afghanistan Taliban delegation who is in Pakistan and has arrived yesterday, and we'll see what came out of the discussions with the Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, and then, of course, the meeting with the Prime Minister Imran Khan, and whether or not that is going to result in something comprehensive towards the restarting of the peace deal between the US and the Taliban. Of course, we also know that Mr. Zalmi Khalilzad is also in town, so we'll see the possibility of any meeting happening between the three parties. We'll also be, of course, taking a look at the situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir, in which the Kashmiris are still suffering. It is the 60th consecutive day today, since the 5th of August, that the curfew and restrictions continue, and traffic is off the roads, and there is shortage of supply of basic food and medicines, and this has been going on for 60 days now. We'll see what the world community has been responding in terms of how Pakistan has highlighted this issue, both at the UN General Assembly and on its sidelines, and what lies ahead in Pakistan's capacity to keep continuing to making sure that the Kashmiris' voice is heard and their struggle reaches its just conclusion. To talk more about this, we have been joined by a senior analyst, Mr. Rauf Hassan. Thank you for being with us, sir.
Sure, thank you.
We've also been joined by foreign affairs expert, Mr. Sajid Iqbal Khattak. Thank you for being with us, sir.
Thank you.
Starting off with the situation in Afghanistan as we see it, and we know that the Taliban delegation is here. They've had meetings with Shah Mahmood Qureshi, but we also know that Mr. Zalmi Khalilzad is here as well. So far we know, as Mr. Shah Mahmood Qureshi is also speaking in his press conference earlier, that they've not had a meeting with the Afghan delegation. Most likely they're not going to. But do you think that there's some sort of negotiations going on between the US side and the Taliban delegation in Pakistan? What role is Pakistan playing in this?
It's very difficult to say anything definitively at this point in time, but I think one of the purposes is to restart the negotiation. I mean, this is why they're elected here, and I believe that there would be some kind of contact, definitely, between the two sides. But the bulk of it will depend after Ambassador Khalilzad, gets in touch with his own government, and shares with them the outcome of discussions that have taken place between the Pakistani side and the Taliban. So far as the Taliban are concerned, basically they've always been, in fact, ever since the day the US said that the deal is dead, they have been very open about it. They said, we're willing to engage to restart the negotiations if there were a need to do that. Otherwise, they have also been saying that the deal is there, so it can be signed whenever they want, whenever the Americans want. What I feel that the Americans want is a little bit more out of the Taliban, so that there's a level of face saving for them. Look at it this way. I mean, it's only 2 weeks, since the deal was sort of cast aside, and within a short period of 2 weeks, they are back and they are apparently willing to re-engage with Taliban. And this speaks, that possibly at their end, there is this clarity of thought that they don't have an alternative but to re-engage with Taliban, to sit across the table with them, and to either sign the deal which is already there with cosmetic changes, or then to rehatch another deal. And I think that is what this meeting is all about. But I think it's a positive indication, that the level of faith in a negotiated settlement in Afghanistan is still there, and both the parties are here. The fact that Ambassador Khalilzad came before the Taliban did, and he's still present in Pakistan, that speaks volumes of a willingness on the part of the US to re-enter the negotiations, to re-engage with the Taliban.
As you said, that this lesson that they've learned, that there is no military conflict, it seems to be a well-learned one, and that they're not going to go back on that one. But as you mentioned, that maybe perhaps they would like something more out of the Taliban side. But Taliban also have said that the deal is almost ready and they just need America to sign it, and it depends on the US how they want to move forward. So in such a scenario, what more can the US be expecting, and what can the Taliban be ready to give, considering they were on a brink of getting a deal?
Thank you so much for inviting me in the show. Basically, I think Taliban have learned and they have got matured over a passage of time. Previously, they were so barbaric and they were so offensive in their outreach towards the United States and all the Afghan affairs. But we see that after Donald Trump announced the falls of the or the cancellation of the peace process in Qatar, we saw that immediately the Taliban spokesperson, he spoke out that we are still ready for the peace negotiations. So
But
that
they also said that America is going to be the one that's going to suffer more.
of course, because the Donald Trump was also having in the same tone. But I think that the United States has very predominantly, I think they were being pressurized by the Afghan government that we are having in upcoming elections in Afghanistan. So if you are going to sign any kind of peace agreement with the Afghan Taliban, so that would definitely impact the Afghan elections. So the United States were already double mind in their outreach towards the peace process. On one hand, Donald Trump was he was basically fulfilling his promise which he made to the United States, to the Americans during his election campaign. But on the other hand, he was constantly being pressurized by the Afghan government. Because Afghan government is a long-standing ally of the United States in their war on terror in Afghanistan. So ultimately that was the decision, but the United States, I think, will still be interested in the peace talks, and they will be looking forward to to gain some more leverage from the Taliban side, and they will be expecting some kind of favor from the Afghan Taliban side. But you see, the Afghan Taliban enjoys a kind of territorial control in Afghanistan. They are almost, almost 50% of Afghan territory is directly controlled by the Afghan Taliban. And you see, in the recent election, there was a 20% or even less than 20% turnout in the Afghan election. So this shows that they still enjoys a considerable influence over the Afghan affairs. So that would not be easy for the United States and even the Afghan government, the upcoming Afghan government, to press Afghan Taliban for some kind of extra leverage. The Afghan Taliban will still enjoy an edge in the negotiations, but yes, the important thing regarding Afghan Taliban is that Afghan Taliban are constantly in touch with Russia, with China, with the Arab countries, and with Pakistan as well, of course. So this is basically giving a message to the United States that if they create any kind of vacuum in Afghan politics, the vacuum will be immediately filled by China and Russia, which of course have their stakes in the region. But that will not be allowed by the United States. You see, for the past 19 years, the United States is there in Afghanistan. So there is a conspiracy theory which says that even if the United States been successful in withdrawing its troops from Afghanistan, the next front would be Iran, because the United States always seeks a reason to stay in South Asia. They have bigger stakes in the region. They want to have their stakes in the Central Asian regions, in India, in Pakistan. So the United States is not going to withdraw completely from this region. They are going to stay here in one way or the other. But let's hope that the peace process between the Afghan Taliban and the United States brings to some conclusion, but that seems quite a complicated process which is yet to be achieved.
Right. Mr. Rauf, do you think that any future deal that we're looking at between the US and Taliban will not include a complete withdrawal of the troops, no matter what timeline they give? But isn't that what the US is really moving towards, or not?
It's not clear. The Americans have not said anything about it. We still don't have access to the contents of the deal that they had signed with the Taliban. Understandably, Pakistan has, made a statement. When the Prime Minister was on a visit to the US, he said that a complete withdrawal of American troops is desirable for the cause of peace in the region. So Pakistan has made its intentions very clear. The Taliban have been demanding it, a complete withdrawal of all foreign troops. As a matter of fact, they said that the elections should be held only once there are no troops on the Afghan soil. So this is so far as this side of the line is concerned, we know the sentiments, but so far as the Americans are concerned, obviously they have stakes in this region. That has not been hidden, and they have not even tried to hide it. Their alignment with India it speaks volumes of those stakes that they have. It's a containment China policy, and it is also that policy evolves or is developed, keeping Iran in mind also. These are two of the many strategic ambitions that the US has in this part of the world. So it's only when one has access, to what has been negotiated between the Taliban and the US that one would be able to say something more definitively. But at this juncture, one feels that yes, what has filtered out was that the Americans, were trying to negotiate a phased out withdrawal, spread over a period of time. And they said, that it's important, not because, they have a strategic ambition in this part of the world, but because their presence is essential for ensuring implementation of the peace deal, which is of the deal which is signed with the Taliban. And that makes a lot of sense, by the way, because, I've written very frequently on the subject, that signing the deal is just one part of the story. Ensuring that the deal is implemented is the more important part of the deal, is the more
Right.
important part of the story.
Right.
So, there were proposals which were thrown up, like, for example, continued American presence for a certain period of time. There was also a proposal that other countries of the region, would come up with their presence, or they would guarantee that whatever is signed between the US and Taliban would be fully implemented. Then there was also at one time a proposal to have a so-called UN military force station there. The Muslim countries force station there. We've gone through all those phases basically. See, but I thought that now the negotiations were around determining the time period that would take for a phased out withdrawal of the American troops from there. And I think this would have covered the area of the induction of the interim government, the holding of elections, the amendments in the constitution, and the holding of fresh elections, So maybe a period of 2 to 2.5 to 3 years. But the important question at this juncture is, what is it that the Americans would want? Like, hypothetically speaking, within a couple of weeks of having aborted the deal, they're back here with, understandably, with eagerness to restart the negotiations. So what is it that they would be expecting of the Taliban so that they can go back and say, look, we've got something more from
Right.
them? So, that is in the ambit of, there were three things basically which were being held against the deal. Number one, this deal is all about peace in Afghanistan, so-called peace in Afghanistan. And the government of Afghanistan was out of this. They were never part of, they were
Exactly.
never made part. That is number one. Number two is there was no ceasefire announced prior to engaging in negotiations with the Taliban. And three is that an upfront announcement that the Americans are determined to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. These were the three things basically on the basis of which there was a lot of criticism that the deal was subjected to. So can the US get something more out of the Taliban in the context of any of these? Maybe they would insist on a ceasefire. That before we make an announcement, before we sign the deal, you announce that there is a ceasefire. Prior to aborting the deal, the prospect of an intra-Afghan dialogue, and the consequent announcement of ceasefire, was to come after the deal had been signed and announced. So
Right,
now
but-
they can possibly bring that forward and say that, all right, we are back on the table, but you give us something else, and that is that you announce a ceasefire or at least a major reduction in violence. I think that it would be possibly, the extra demand would be around this
Right, perhaps they
particular
could
issue.
move towards that. But in the previous discussions that I've had in the negotiation of the deal, they've only been focusing on the fact that the Afghan soil is not used for terrorist activities to harm US or its
Right.
allies, and then, of course, the withdrawal of the troops. And the possibility
But
of
that was number four.
intra-Afghan dialogue was kept as something which will look after that.
Right.
And of course, that was before, and maybe, perhaps, hopefully, that would change now. But we also see that when we talk about the US-Taliban deal, their focus has been on these two aspects that I just mentioned. And Prime Minister Imran Khan has always talked about how the Afghan government is to be involved as well, and the intra-Afghan dialogue is, of course, more impactful and far more important as well after the US troops leave. When we see the elections, as you just mentioned, with such low turnout and violence and voter fraud, and which questions the legitimacy of the election, and the Taliban have always questioned the legitimacy of the government. So in that respect, now that we see the delegation coming into Pakistan, how much can we see Pakistan involving the Afghan government and the Taliban taking that into account, considering the elections were just something that they don't consider legitimate?
Well, I think at this time our country is very much precautious in dealing with the Afghan problem, because they do not want to repeat the mistake which they have made during the Soviet Union invasion in Afghanistan in 1979. Because at that moment we were so much, towards the Afghan Taliban, and it is a proven fact. But you see, when in 2001 the United States intervened in Afghanistan, they immediately overthrew the Afghan Taliban government in Afghanistan. So afterwards, one of the main agenda, or you can see the strategy of the United States in Afghanistan was to install a Western democracy in Afghanistan. That was one of the objectives of the United States in Afghanistan, which they have not so far been successful, because you see, a 15 to 20% turnout does not mean that the election is legitimate, and even that 15 to 20% turnout has some problems regarding riggings and
But
some
if the
other
US
issues.
or other world powers will
Yes,
consider
of
it
course.
legitimate, then automatically other countries will be dealing with it, no?
And then Afghan Taliban will then again be calling it a puppet government of the US, and that
Right.
won't work for the
So we're
Afghan.
going
You
to run
see,
in circles.
out of only 20% or 15% of the total Afghan population cannot decide the future of their government. But you see, the form of democracy in Afghanistan does not mean that it has to be on the Western model. You see, there can be democracy in Afghanistan based on the local tradition and practices of Afghans. You see, there is a Jarga system in Afghanistan's culture, which is purely a kind of a democratic practice, because they take into account the opinions of their elders, of their tribal elders, and based on those opinions, they make some collective decisions for their nation. So I think it is the time for the world to realize that the Western model of democracy is not compatible with everywhere in the world. We need to have a regional form of democracy in some parts of the world. For example, in Afghanistan, you have different factions. You have Pashtuns, you have Uzbeks, you have Hazaras communities, and they all have different beliefs over the political system in Afghanistan. So let's give them a consociational democracy. Let's give a chance to consociational democracy, a power sharing democracy, where you give the Afghan Taliban a chance to establish their government in the respective areas where the population supports them, or you can say they have a physical control over a territory, and gave the Uzbek population their right to enjoy their favorable political system. And the same for the Hazaras communities and other communities in Afghanistan, ethnic groups in Afghanistan. So overall, at the center, these all governments will be having a unified government. You can say in consociational democracy, we have different political systems at the local level, but a unified and a central government at the center. This will basically allow the different factions. The problem is of power. Every warlord, every ethnic group in Afghanistan, they seek some kind of power in the government. So by doing this, they will be having some kind of share in the government, and ultimately there will be you can say for a time being a peaceful environment in Afghanistan. That is very necessary for immediately to stop violence in Afghanistan. If
Okay.
you see, if the deal is finalized between the United States and the Afghan Taliban, but still there are agreements between the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government and some other groups, so that deal would not be beneficial for the Afghan people. And the basic, the people who are vulnerable to war for the past 40 years are the Afghan people. And both Afghan Taliban, Afghan government, everybody residing in Afghanistan is Afghani. So the basic question is to safeguard their lives and to give some relief to the Afghan people. That would only be possible if there is an agreement between the Afghan Talibans. And the local Afghans.
Right. Another thing that I want to talk about was the fact that when the Prime Minister was in the US, he also mentioned the fact that the Taliban delegation wanted to meet him previously as well. But the Afghan government requested him not to do so. And now that the Taliban delegation is here, how is this going down with the Afghan government, and how do you think they're going to be involved in the process now, when they've always wanted to be part of the negotiating table and not that they're included later on? So how is Pakistan going to deal with that?
Just a small comment. It's one Afghanistan that we have been talking about and we must talk about. It's not an Afghanistan which is divided into bits and pieces, on the basis of ethnic interests and divisions. That no ethnic group, would accept that prospect. So it's basically one country that we have to ensure it stays. It has been and it stays as. Whatever system of government evolves or is developed or is agreed upon has to be on the basis of one Afghanistan, not multiple Afghanistans. That's very important. Number one. Number two, coming to your question, between then and now, one significant change has occurred. elections in Afghanistan have taken place. Whether there was a low attendance, a low vote cast, that's another matter altogether. And it is not for us to determine the legitimacy of that election, because it's going to be the government of Afghanistan which is going to, and the rest of the, the world basically, which is going to accord or refuse to accord legitimacy to that election. That election has taken place.
But whether the Taliban accord legitimacy to it or not, isn't that important?
No, Taliban alone cannot decide the fate of Afghanistan, just like nobody else, no other ethnic minority can decide the fate of Afghanistan by itself. So it has to be a consensus, and this is in fact, this has been one of the principal assertions that I have talked about and written about, that the first and foremost thing in Afghanistan, for actually peace to return to Afghanistan and deal, even if deal is signed today or in a few days or in a few weeks, if the deal is signed, that is no guarantee for peace to return to Afghanistan. For peace to return to Afghanistan, it is just a deal between the US and Taliban, and it is more like a platform for the US to be able to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, which is what it has been wanting to do for a long time now. So it's a convenient way for them, but it does not guarantee peace in Afghanistan. What will guarantee peace in Afghanistan is a consensus among all stakeholders. And for that, they have to sit on the table and talk to each other and see exactly how is it that they would like to govern Afghanistan. And I'm sure they would all look at governing Afghanistan as one country, not as 6 countries, not as 10 countries. So that is one predicament. But the fact that the election has taken place, and President Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah both have claimed victory in the election, which possibly is going to pave the way for some more conflict, some more violence in Afghanistan. But this is what he wanted to do. He wanted to oversee the deal signed between the US and the Taliban. He did not want this to precede the elections. And in fact, that is why in America, most of the people said that President Ghani has actually become an impediment in the way of the deal, which he had actually. He was insisting. And in fact, there were few supporters. Bulk of the ethnic minorities also said that, well, maybe this is not an opportune time to hold elections, but he has gone ahead and held the elections. Its fate, of course, is going to be determined later. Now that he's in charge, or he will be the likely in charge of things in Afghanistan, he possibly would look at things in a different way. He would have no issue with coming to an understanding and agreement with the Taliban, because he's there for another 5 years, or this is actually what he thinks. So whether the rest of the world is going to acknowledge him or legitimize him in that capacity, in that position for the next 5 years, that's another thing. But obviously he is going to insist that he's there, he's won the election. So this is one radical change, one radical shift has occurred. So and that is why the fact that the Afghan government has not objected to the Taliban traveling to Pakistan now, because now they will be supportive of that.
Right.
But they were not supportive of that in the past, because of this one very, very important step having been taken in Afghanistan.
Right. We also know that the Taliban delegation, before visiting to Pakistan, visited Russia and China as well. How do you see these two regional powers playing a role in this peace process?
I think Russian resurgence is on the cards. You see the international commentators, they are commenting and they are writing over the Russian resurgence. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990s, Russia has constantly been improving its political, economic and military outreach. SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is one of the most important manifest of this. It has already designed a group for the conflict in Afghanistan. The SCO has already designed a group which will be dealing the Afghan problem. So through SCO, China and Russia both can influence and can effectively play their role in stabilizing Afghanistan. You see, the Belt and Road Initiative of China is one of the global projects which China is interested in, and CPEC is one of its part. So until and unless there is peace in Afghanistan, the CPEC, the security of CPEC will be at stake. And same is true for the Belt and Road Initiative, because Central Asia and all other parts which are related to Afghanistan, which are relevant to Afghanistan, will be directly or indirectly impacted by the security situations in Afghanistan. So China enjoys, and they have a direct economic interest in China, in Afghanistan. The same is true for Russia, because you see, Central Asian republics are at the backyard of Russia, and Russia historically enjoys its dominance and its political advantage over other superpowers in Central Asia. So if there is instability in Afghanistan, the United States will stay in Afghanistan, which is a constant danger for Russia, because the United States, you see, the new great game is all about the United States, China, and Russia interest in the Central Asian republics' energy resources. So, but if peace comes in Afghanistan, the United States is going to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, which is in the direct favor of Russia and China. As I already mentioned, that if the United States and the Afghan Taliban, they are not successful in concluding any agreement over the troops withdrawal and other things, Russia and China will directly be filling the vacuum in Afghanistan, and they will take the lead. But at the moment, you see, for the past 19 years, it is the United States which is basically investing in Afghanistan, and they have stakes in each and every corner of Afghanistan, in each and every sector of Afghanistan. So for that moment, Russia and China is deliberately avoiding to interfere in the Afghan affairs, but they are indirectly, or they are convening, or they are basically acting as a catalyst in the Afghan peace process. But as I said, that the most important thing is that the negotiations between Afghan Taliban and the United States come to some reasonable conclusion, and both Russia and China will be on board in this regard.
Right. Okay. Just last on this topic, Mr. Rav, when we earlier talked about the fact that it's important to ensure implementation of the peace deal, and which is the bigger question here. When we do hopefully get a deal, how do we expect the US to stick to it, since they've had a history of backing out from their deals, of course, previously also we've seen with Iran and in other scenarios. So how binding would this treaty or this deal be for the US in particular?
I'm not as concerned about the Americans sticking to the deal as I am about the Taliban sticking to the deal, basically, and the implementation mechanism, which the negotiating countries want to devise, is to ensure that the Taliban implement what they agree to. That's important, and it's important in the context of what has been discussed and decided, which is point 1 and 2, the Taliban committing that the Afghan soil will not be used for any terrorist activities, and the Americans committing to withdraw troops. More importantly, it's about the inter-Afghan dialogue, that they hold the inter-Afghan dialogue, they come to an understanding and agreement with all of the stakeholders in Afghanistan, because nobody is interested in Taliban putting together a government on their own. That they alone cannot represent the entire Afghanistan. They alone are not the only stakeholder, the sole stakeholder of Afghanistan. So they have to engage in an inter-Afghan dialogue with the rest of the stakeholders and come to an understanding and agreement. And then, of course, is the fact that they have to announce a ceasefire. It is going to be a comprehensive ceasefire which will bring the war to an end in Afghanistan. And then from there on, they can move. How do they want to proceed further? The proposals which had been put on the table, included the induction of an interim government, spread over 18 to 24 months, so that the amendments that the Taliban have been talking about making in the constitution, they are put on the table, they are negotiated among all stakeholders, and then they decide what amendments to incorporate and what amendments not to incorporate. And they have a final constitution, and the elections were to be held on the basis of that final approved constitution. Unfortunately, that has not been the case, and President Ghani has gone ahead with holding elections in Afghanistan, which have created an additional problem. And of course, this additional thing, will come on the table. I mean, Taliban are going to ask the US government, how are they going to deal with this? I mean, are you going to ask him to vacate the seat? And, leading the way to holding fresh elections, that will be participated by the Taliban alongside all other ethnic minorities? Or is it that the Taliban will have to wait for another 5 years to be able to take part in elections? So this is going to be a very major issue on the table. And I think US will have to use a level of muscle to convince President Ghani that for the sake of peace returning to Afghanistan, which is the principal occupation of all countries, including Pakistan and other regional countries, that peace must return to Afghanistan. It is not just the deal that we want to see signed between the US and Taliban, because that's no guarantee, as I said earlier, for peace returning to Afghanistan. Peace must return to Afghanistan, and for that it's important that all stakeholders must be in agreement. This is the way to move forward. And President Ghani is not the only stakeholder. Taliban are not the only stakeholder. ABC, XYZ are not the only stakeholders. They will become stakeholders, when they develop a consensus that this is the best way to take Afghanistan forward.
Right, now moving towards, of course, our next topic, which is Kashmir, and we know that the atrocities continue for the 60th day today. And we know that the UN General Assembly session, and on its sidelines also, this issue was highlighted by the Prime Minister, and it has been highlighted since the 5th of August when Article 370 was abrogated. Considering how much Pakistan has put forward, how do you so far feel with response to the international community and their efforts in this regard? We also know that the US Congressional Subcommittee is going to be focusing on this. We know that the European Parliament took up this issue. And we know that a lot of people who are influencers in the world have been talking about the human atrocities in Kashmir. But then again, we still see that 60 days have gone by and we don't really have a real direction.
Thank you. Basically, you see, India has now become a world power. A world power, we mean the 6th largest economy of the world. And you see, the commercial relations have superseded the military, the political relationships in the world. The world enjoys good commercial relations with India, and they are not going to, put pressure on India in order to take back their decisions. What there is going to happen is that the whole world is going to raise voices for the human rights violations in Kashmir. But the problem which Pakistan is concerned more about is that the historical position, the constitutional position of Kashmir is changed by India, which is unlikely to be returned or get back by the Indian government. This is the main problem because you see the United Nations resolutions regarding Kashmir, they are not taken into account. You see, the Muslim countries, the Arab countries, they have taken back and they have taken a step back from Pakistan, and they are trying to convince Pakistan that do not make Kashmir the problem of Muslim Ummah. So the point which I am trying to make is that Pakistan at the moment should be advancing their commercial relations with the world. It is not going to happen abruptly, but for a time being there is a lesson for Pakistan to learn that your political relationship, your religious relationships are now important, but not that much important, where your commercial relationships are important. But one hope for the Kashmiris is there. That is the case which is going on in the Indian Supreme Court, which because if it decides in favor of Kashmir and they orders to reverse the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A, that would be a big relief for the Kashmiris. But for seeking any kind of help from the international community that India is going to reverse its decision based on international pressure, which is very much unlikely. Of course, India is fearful of relaxing their security situation in Kashmir, because if India do so, the Kashmiris will be showing their reaction, which so far they are forcefully being suppressed in India. You see,
right.
Yes.
Right.
So if India, relaxes its security pressures on the Kashmiris, there will be a reaction, and the reaction will, of course, will be seen by the world, and more international pressure will be coming on India. So for a time being, there are no chances, or rare chances, of India being reversing its decision or it's being relaxing their situation in Kashmir.
Right, Mr. Ram, do you expect something positive to come out of the Supreme Court's decision?
In India?
Yes.
So far, the way the hearing has been conducted, does not give me much optimism. They've given another 4 weeks to the Indian government to submit the response. They could delay it by another 4 weeks or so. See, you have to understand that there is a change which has occurred in India. The secular concept, the secular foundations of India have been badgered irretrievably. And I don't think as long as the BJP government is there, or the successors, in case they continue ruling India, that there is going to be a return to those secular traditions. So India has moved on to the Hindutva, to the RSS ideology. And this is what our government has also been propounding, has been projecting to the world. So it's very difficult to expect or to hope that any institution operating within the environment of Hindutva ideology would be able to operate the way it has been operating in the past 6 decades, 6.5 decades. So although I was also associating a lot of hope with the Indian Supreme Court, and particularly in the context of them already having delivered 3 adjudications, in support of continuing with Article 370 as an integral component of the Indian Constitution, but now that it has been removed unilaterally by the government of India, and Indian Kashmir has been integrated as a union territory. I don't know whether the Supreme Court would per se like to intervene in a political matter, or they would much rather go with what the government has decided and sort of legitimize that. So although it was one of the principal hopes that I was also associating with changing the currency of developments, I feel that maybe that is not as important as I thought about 4 to 6 weeks ago. But one thing, which definitely I'm still pinning hope on. The Indian Kashmir has been under a lockdown for 60 days, as you've also mentioned. How long further can they keep it under a lockdown?
Well, for the
Another
next
10
4
days,
weeks,
another
it seems
15
that they
days,
can.
another 4 weeks, another 6 weeks. The issue is that whenever they lift the lockdown, be it in a month, be it in 2 months, be it 3 months, be it in 4 months, and the longer they keep Indian Kashmir under a lockdown, the more intense is going to be the resentment, once it is lifted. And if there is an upsurge of violence, if the people of Kashmir rise in rebellion against the union government, then the world possibly, would be forced to take a more serious note of this. The world has been taking a note of it. I think, I have not seen the kind of criticism, which has been directed at the Indian government, by virtually the entire international media, as has happened in the last 4 to 8 weeks. So they're under a lot of pressure, and I feel that, I think
But
because of this pressure, they will have to lift the lockdown, and on that possibly would depend which
But the
way.
Indian action still, it seems like that they're not really feeling the pressure.
No, they are feeling the pressure.
Okay.
I beg to disagree with that, in the sense, they don't have to make a statement that we are under pressure, but I feel that they have never been subject to this kind of criticism. I mean, you go back in time, you go back a few years, they've never been subjected to this kind of criticism. I mean, it's after a long gap of 54 years that the Kashmir dispute has come back to the international forum. Indians never expected that this is the way it is, things may happen. So, I mean, so many people have not just taken note of the situation in Indian Kashmir, they have debated it in their parliaments, and they've come up with statements, which are very critical of India. Look at the media all over the world, which virtually they have been unanimously critical of what India has done, and they've all been urging the Indian government to lift the lockdown. And when the real game will begin when the lockdown is lifted.
Right. We also know that the Prime Minister is going to be visiting China soon, and he's also expected to raise this issue once again. And then we know that the Chinese leadership is going to be meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What do you expect to come out of that? Since China itself is also has a problem with Ladakh being also termed as a union territory, so it has its own issues with India as well. How do you think that meeting is going to come about?
The position of China is very clear over Kashmir. They have a clear stance that Kashmir is a disputed territory which needs to be resolved as per the UN resolutions. Their position is very clear, and Prime Minister's visit to China, I think, will be very much beneficial in terms of the progress on CPEC. You see, there are rumors in Pakistan, outside Pakistan, that the progress on CPEC is being stalled or it has been slowed down. So that would be more beneficial or tilted towards that thing rather Kashmir, because China is not an issue. China has already advocated in favor of Pakistan. But you see, now what are the options left with Pakistan with regard to Kashmir? Because you see, international organizations, international community are not going ahead with from just verbal criticisms of the human rights violations in Kashmir. No resolution is coming against India, either in the Amnesty International or any other human rights organization. Things are only limited to the verbal criticism of Indian atrocities in Kashmir, which is not going to help the Kashmiris either, or our stance on Kashmir. So at the moment, Pakistan has a very important, card in Pakistan's hand, which Pakistan can effectively play. I will endorse the recommendation by the Minister Fawad Chaudhry in the Assembly, which says that we should cut down our diplomatic relations with India, which is almost nominal with no fruitful results. You see, if we do so, this will give a message to the world, a serious message to the world, that now the relations or the situations between Pakistan and India are deteriorating fastly. One clear message was given by Prime Minister Imran Khan at the UN General Assembly, and if this step is taken here in Pakistan, this will be a kind of practical manifestation of the Imran Khan speech at the UN, that now the relations are going out of control, and I think that would be the moment where some serious involvement or interference will be made by the international community.
Well, we hope it doesn't come to that, but thank you very much.
It should not come to that.
Of course.
It should not come
Of
to
course.
that, because the channels of communication and dialogue must be kept open. That is the only way to move forward on any dispute between any two countries.
Absolutely. Thank you for being with us, gentlemen. Well, you heard the conversation. Much remains to be seen of what develops in Kashmir and in Afghanistan, and we will hope for the best in both the regions. That's all we have time for. Thank you for watching.